السلام عليكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد. My name is Dr. Mohamed Moustafa Mahmoud. You know me as Dr. 3M. I am the CEO of Madinah Institute of Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE in Madinah Munawara. We are so pleased today to have a webinar in a very important topics that all of us has been looking forward to, especially with the launch of the Saudi Vision 2030, with all vision programs have already outlined their objectives and KPIs and the initiatives, as well as many government and non-government organizations. Now we are in the turning point of going from planning to delivery. The topic of today is how can we mobilize our resources in order to deliver by building capability to deliver on programs and attain results in a sustainable way. I'm so pleased to welcome Mr. Mark Dorsett. He's our presenter today. Mr. Mark is the Executive Vice President of Global Business for Prosci, the largest organization known in the world for their competency in the area of change management. He also currently responsible for Prosci Global Business, along with the information, communication, and technology functions. Our webinar will be about 45 minutes. The presentation will last to about 30 to 40 minutes. I would like to thank Mark Dorsett for getting up early. It's now, as I understand, 6 a.m. in Fort Collins, which is north of Denver, Colorado. And all your comments will be observed and recorded by my colleague Ahmed, who's supporting me. And in the proper time at the end of the presentation, we will be able to share them with the presenter to answer whatever he can manage to answer at this time. And there will be always an open channel for any further communication or inquiries about the topic. Without further ado, I would like to leave the floor to Mr. Mark Dorsett. Good morning, Mr. Dorsett, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. 3M. It is indeed a great privilege to be able to spend a little time with you this afternoon and to, as he mentioned, talk through this conversation of how do we take what is a fantastic vision for the next 11 years yet and the strategies that have already been put in place and to make those reality. We decided to describe this as going really from mobilize to deliver and thinking about how do we build capability so that we can accomplish our objectives in a sustainable way. And so with that, we'll go through a number of topics today. And as Dr. 3M mentioned, give the opportunity for you to ask any questions, seek any additional feedback at the end. So I sometimes start with a story. Now, in this case, this is not a make-believe story. This is a real story. And we know, as has already been described, that there is a fantastic vision and there is a strategy. Many of the ministries, the various initiatives have been working on this for the last few years. We know the goals. We know the key performance indicators, but we're far from achieving that vision. So yeah, the goal has not yet been realized. That doesn't mean that there are problems, but it does mean there is still a lot of work to do. One of the key things that I get to observe when I work with organizations across the globe is that whenever there is a strategy to be implemented, some form of imperative that must be accomplished, it requires change. By definition, a program initiative requires change. And we know that change comes in many forms, but it also requires a coordinated effort to be successful. And that's why today we decided, how do we describe this in a way that is sustainable? It's not just an event, but it has momentum and purpose and can be effective over the long term. So strategy does indeed require change. Now, the other thing that we know, and we've all been a part of this for many years, that as much as we put in a new technology, a new system, a new organization, a new process, a new way of thinking, ultimately societies, organizations don't change. It's the people within those groups that change. And so that's going to be the focus of the rest of our time today is how do we help those individuals catch that vision and do this in a sustaining way, because that's how what we need to accomplish our initiative. However, there are challenges. We do a lot of research in this topic of how do people successfully adopt and utilize new ways of working, new societal objectives. And one of the key things we've learned, especially in the last 5 years, is that many times people struggle with too many changes, too many new things coming at them, not being able to become sufficient and proficient at one initiative before there's another one immediately on them. Oftentimes we call that change saturation. And so that's what we'd like to help you avoid, is having people feel this overwhelmingness that can come upon us when there are too many things, because there are negative consequences. From the research, we learned that initiatives and projects don't achieve their objectives when people are not able to take on all of these new things in a competitive and in a sustainable way. The research shows it. So what we'd like to do is turn to how do we prepare our people, our organizations, even the society to do this more effectively so that we can accomplish these objectives. I'm going to start with a very simple model here. On the top, you'll see that whenever we begin something, we have a current state. It could be a process, it could be a system, it could be an organization, it could be a business, it could be some existing way of doing things. We're going to go through a transition. And whether that transition is a few hours or as many months or even years, we go through that transition state before we can arrive at the state or the way that we're intending to get to. And we often think about that. When I read through some of the initiatives that are part of the Transformation 2030 initiative, I can clearly see what is the intended outcome. But as I mentioned on the previous page, those are great statements. But ultimately, it takes all of the individual people to go through that transition into that future way of doing things. And what we've learned through many, many years of research is that not everybody moves at the same pace. Not everybody is able to accept that new way of working with the same open-mindedness. And so our focus today is how do we make sure that we bring along the whole community, the whole organization into that desired future state by going through the transition and focusing on understanding why is it that some people readily accept these things? Why do some people push back with resistance? And what do we need to do to help them get there? So I frequently describe this from a project perspective is there's a technical side to the things we do as well as a people side. Now, just because I use the word technical doesn't mean that I'm talking about a technology implementation, although it does fit for that. But whenever we're doing something, there is a design component, something that we want to see in the future. For example, we could move from a model where things are provided by the government to where they are provided by private organizations. We could go from a centralized organization to a decentralized organization. We could go from one to many organizations, or there could be any number of things that we put together. I call that the technical side of what we're doing. And the intent there is to design, develop, and deliver the new desired way of being or working. On the people side, we think about it this way. All of those who are a part of it, all of those who are impacted by it, we need to focus on how will they embrace this new way, how will they adopt it in their mind and in their thinking, and ultimately, how do they use it effectively? It's when we bring these two things together that we have the opportunity to achieve the results, the outcomes, and the success that we're after. I frequently call this the unified value proposition because it takes both parts of the equation in order to achieve success. Today, we're going to focus our time more on the bottom side of this, the people side of getting to our ability to have the results that we want. So what is change management? Dr. 3M used that term at the beginning of our session and said, that is what we, Prosci, focus on. And that is indeed the case. But it is often a term that is not well understood. And so I'm going to share a quote from Tim Creasy. Tim Creasy is our Chief Innovation Officer at Prosci, and he describes it this way. Change management is how we mobilize our people to deliver expected results and outcomes in times of change. So let's think about those key words for a moment. It's how we mobilize our people. On the previous page, I said it is the bottom part of this equation. It's how do we focus on getting people ready to embrace, adopt, and use in a sustainable way, in a way that's not just an event or a little blip on a chart that becomes the new normal way of doing things. So it's how we mobilize our people with a strong focus on outcomes, with the expected results. Sometimes change management has been described as the soft side of things. And while I don't disagree with that, I think it doesn't do change management justice. When have any of us ever found that working with people is soft, that it's easy? I often find it's very challenging. It can be rewarding, and there's ways that we can do it in a predictable and sustainable way, but it's not only the soft side of things. So there's structure and intent that we can apply to this. And when there's a strong focus on doing that as an outcome during a period of change. And certainly, as we look at the very broad and high-level objectives of the Transformation 2030 initiative, that is certainly a time of change. So if you think about it this way, that's how I think of change management. It's mobilizing the people so that we can get to those objectives that we're after. Is there any value to this? Is there any kind of science or information or data that says spending time on helping people actually has an impact? And the good news is, very, very clearly, I'm only going to share one particular piece of data with you today. And this is coming from our research database that has over 8,000 projects. And we look at which ones achieved their objectives, which one had a return on investment, which one had a improved customer satisfaction or better employee engagement or reduced cost or achieved the outcome, and which ones did not. And what we were able to correlate is that those that had a strong and excellent focus on helping to prepare people through the use of change management achieved their objectives 93% of the time. Those that only did it poorly were only successful 15% of the time. So sometimes we refer to this as the 6 times or the 6x, because going through this type of work improves our likelihood of being successful 6 times. The other thing that I like to point out on here is, pardon me, this is not a binary situation like turning on a light switch. It is a spectrum. So even doing change management a little bit better, you have better opportunity for being successful. If we do it good, there's even a higher likelihood. The other thing, and I won't share the details, is not only are we more likely to achieve our objectives, we're also much more likely to stay on schedule and on budget because we're not having to do a lot of rework, re-support, replanning, and so on. So there's a little bit of information just on, is there validity in taking this on? Our studies are not alone. There's a study here from McKenzie, the executive management consulting firm, that said those who apply change management effectively achieved their expected value at a rate of 143% times the business case. Those who did it poorly only achieved 35% of their outcomes. So once again, the data is there. Spending time on this has a direct impact. Now, as I think about the relevancy for the Transformation 2030 initiative, I realize that it is far more than a project. It is a sustaining activity over more than a decade to achieve the results. And so the statement is, if we can do this once, sure, that's good. And there's a successful project. But if we can do it across a program, across a way of thinking, we're going to have even better outcomes from what we're after. So I describe it as change management on one project is good, but throughout a program, of course, is even better. And so how do we do that? How do we get to the point where we can plan for it, measure it, and know whether or not we're achieving our objective? Within Prosci, we've been focusing on this discussion of enterprise change management. That is what ECM stands for, enterprise change management. You will hear some people refer to it as organizational change management. I think in most scenarios, those are interchangeable terms. So if you hear me say ECM and you're used to OCM, or maybe you've heard neither, that's what it means. How do we do this from an entire organizational perspective? We focus on 5 areas, and I'll spend a little bit of time on each of those today and then provide an opportunity to follow up to achieve greater information. So we focus on leadership, on applying this in a project environment. What are the skills and capabilities required to be successful? From a structure perspective, as we think through a major initiative or organization, how do we do this? And then finally, what are the impact of processes? We'll spend a few moments on each of those today. Let me just share a couple of examples before we move into the details. What you see in the chart, this kind of spider chart, is the light purple color would represent the current capabilities of an organization at this time. And they want to improve how they're doing things. So for example, if they wanted to improve their project effectiveness, there might be a new requirement that every change management project, or every project, I should say, spending $500,000 or more has to have a formalized change management plan. That would be one example of how we would start to focus on the project side of this ECM strategy map. I'll share a couple other examples. Here we focus on how do we develop the skills and capabilities. While the human resource organization might initiate a campaign to measure each role's capability, I'll describe that in a little bit more detail today, but to measure each organizational role's capability to lead and implement change, and then based on that understanding, based on that baseline, take on an initiative to focus on how do we upskill, how do we teach people to do this more effectively. From the process side. And so what we might do here is to integrate change management processes into the standard project delivery methods, ways of doing work, so that they can be consistently applied across every initiative and project. We'll spend a couple of moments describing how that can be possible and what types of process integration makes sense to consider. Another example, if we wanted to have a combined focus at the project level as well as the skill, we might say every new initiative, every project has to do an assessment of the capabilities of those people when they begin the project, and then based on that, we'll undertake some education. And then finally, as an example, from a structure perspective, some organizations will then say, we will take a organization and we'll put it at a corporate or at a top level organization so that it has oversight into the change management activities of all initiatives. This would be similar to a project management office or a strategy office, that type of thing. So these are some examples. What does that actually look like? How do we take that into being? The first one we will focus on is leadership. From our research, we have learned that the number one factor that can indicate how successful a program, a project is successful leadership. That's a fantastic statement, and probably all of us would agree with it. The question is, what does that mean? And are there some characteristics that we can focus on to better have that leadership that we need? And so we would focus on things like a leadership commitment statement. We would focus on how fast are we going to move these projects and initiatives through our organization. Here's an example. We've worked with many, many organizations across the globe. And what we find is that alignment on purpose, alignment on the words, alignment on a common definition, as well as the support, is incredibly important. One of the things that we will frequently do is get leaders together for a 1-day or possibly 2-day workshop to focus on how are we actually going to achieve the objectives that are part of our initiative. And we will write things out in form of a commitment statement. It has an impact. When we take the time to write something down or maybe even sign our names to it, it tends to resonate with us and mean a little bit more than simply talking about it in a session. So an example, as you could see, this is from a profitable or a private organization that said, we need to build the agility of our organization and ourselves as individuals to manage change effectively, and in a way that is consistent with our culture to improve business performance and strategic execution. To accomplish this, we are therefore committed to increasing our change capability by building individual competencies, embedding adoption enablement practices into our initiatives. So this was a commitment from the senior leaders, the executive personnel in the organization. This is just an example. So it's one part of that. I'm going to take a moment here and focus on the project level. What are the specific activities, but more importantly, what are the outputs, the deliverables that we can focus on from a change management perspective, and how do we do this in a way that can become the new norm, that can be consistent so that we know whether or not we're being successful? When I look at it from a standard, kind of a generic perspective, I'm going to describe it this way. On the top row, we see a general project lifecycle. And whenever there is a project, almost everybody knows the kickoff date, the date that the team organized and had their first session, and we know the go live date, the date that the new organization is in process, the new building facility being used, the system turned on, the organizations merged together. Whatever it might be, we know those go live dates. And most organizations have a project lifecycle that looks something like this: initiate, plan, design, develop, and deploy. I am showing this currently in a sequential, or what might be called a waterfall approach. There, of course, are many, many organizations that do this in a more iterative, following agile principles. The concepts that I'm describing work equally well in either type of environment. For the simplicity of today, and since we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to show it just this way. I mentioned earlier that organizations don't change, people do. And I showed a chart that said we have to move that entire group of people from the current way through the transition period into the desired future state. The way that we look at it is from an individual level, they go through a process of adoption. It's called ADKAR. Awareness of the need to change, desire to participate, knowledge of what I need to do differently in that environment, the ability to actually act or use systems or cooperate in that new way, and then it needs to be reinforced. We know that any change doesn't just happen as an event, it needs reinforcement. And so we look at how do we plan these steps for every individual who's impacted and making sure that we understand where each individual is at. From a project integration perspective, we can integrate the change management activities into the rest of the project. There are many things that we would do in preparing for change, managing change, and then reinforcing the change. And while I won't have time to show the details with you, there is ways that we can help integrate those activities into what I call an integrated master plan, with integrated resources, schedules, budgets, and so on, so that we're able to bring together that concept that I showed before, where we have the technical design and we have the people design. And it's when we bring those things together that we have the opportunity to achieve our objectives. So from a project perspective, we need to look at how do we integrate the people activities with the more technical or hard activities that are typically part of our plans. As I mentioned, this is the way it might come together. I'll just share this as a simple example. And how do we integrate change management? Once again, that is how we prepare and equip our people to go through periods of change. So for example, we might have a requirement at the initiation to define the impacted groups and how they are specifically impacted. We may create a customized and scaled strategy so that we're applying the right amount of change management for every initiative. If we're doing something simple in a small work group of 5 people, our change management plan might be accomplished in a few moments or minutes. But if we're talking something as large as the Transformation 2030 initiative and all the various components in there, all of those work streams, that may take a lot more focus. So this is where we would incorporate those change management activities in the planning stage. We would add the people side into the technical design as we go into the design and develop. We're integrating change management into our review sessions, our project gates, so that we can assess, are we on track with these activities or are we not? I think you get the picture. There are standard ways of doing this by following a common methodology so that we know whether or not we've accomplished that and we are likely to be set up for success. Once again, I mentioned, if we do this once, we will have benefit, and that's important. But in something as large as what all of you are going through, we have to do this not even once or 10 or 100. I'm going to say it has to occur 1,000 times over in a consistent and repeatable way so that we can sustain the results that we're focused on. And so that's how we think about this from an enterprise or an organization change management perspective that I defined a few minutes earlier. Now let's focus on skill for a couple of moments. Skill is the capability to perform the change management roles based on your activity or your position in a various initiative. Let me share that with you briefly here today. What we've learned through thousands and thousands of projects that we've been a part of is that everybody involved with the change has a different role to play. I'll highlight those very briefly. Executives and senior leaders need to be effective sponsors of change. We've put this into a simple model to remember. It's called the ABCs: to be active and visible, to build coalitions, and to communicate directly with employees. That sounds simple, and it actually is, but there's a lot of detail, a lot of focus behind it so that we can measure whether or not that's happening effectively, and we can also know whether or not the people who are at that sponsor level are actually accomplishing it in a way that has impact and value. We know that those who are in a management function, line supervisors, if I want to use that term, they have to support their employees or their organizations through that period of change. Once again, we have a model for them, and it focuses on communication, on liaison, being between them and the project team, to be an advocate for change, to help with resistance management, and to communicate and support and coach people effectively. And there's a lot of detail on how that can best be accomplished. Yes, even those who are impacted, those that we could describe as the frontline associates or the members of the community, we need to help them understand why is it that this change is coming through, what is expected of them, what they can expect, and help them through that individual ad card journey that I mentioned a couple of pages ago. And then finally, how do we do this in a repeatable and structured way with our project teams, with our specialists who do this very effectively, so that we can design solutions with adoption and usage in mind. Kind of reminds me of one of these themes that's very common throughout the globe right now in terms of a design-centered focus. And that is really on how do we make sure that we think about who is impacted and how they're impacted before we start designing the solution. So design-centered thinking, system-centered thinking is a key component of that. The other thing that I will look at and not spend much time on today is when we think about how to enable and equip the individuals and organizations, it should influence our hiring, our onboarding, training, coaching of people, as well as the objectives that we put in place, the competency models that we measure whether or not people are at the level that makes an impact, our development plans, performance management and review process. All of those should be impacted if we want to be successful at building the competencies in the organization. One way that can look is through a holistic approach to development. And so once again, this isn't a one-size-fits-all training program or set of tools or methodology that we simply throw at people. We need to be very intentional in the way that we help people understand their role at leading and implementing change. As an example, I mentioned that executives have this role that we describe as ABC, for being active and visible, building coalitions, and communicating directly with those who are impacted. Most executives, myself included, really do not want to go sit in a training program for a half a day or a day. But we are willing to invest time, specifically on a project or initiative, to understand what is working well and what needs to be put in place in order to be effective. So this sponsor program is really a workshop that says, how do we develop the plans effectively for this particular initiative, and how do I understand what I need to do to focus on this? So we describe this as the holistic approach to building change management capability, because there's different needs for different levels in the organization. Let me focus a couple of moments on structure, the third component or the fourth component that we're going to look at. How do we think about this from an organization perspective so that we have the right focus, the right amount of resources in more of a centralized capacity or in a very distributed capacity? And what we've learned through years of doing this is there isn't a single right answer. Depending on the characteristics of the organization, some tend to be very centrally driven and want to take a common theme and focus and do it in a very consistent way and manage things from that perspective. Other organizations, think of a retail example, if you could, where you have stores throughout the region. That's going to be much more of a decentralized focus because people are spread out so far. And so thinking of how are we going to build this capability into the way that makes sense for our organization? How do we know that the right people have the accountability as well as the responsibility to achieve this? Quickly looking at the research, what we've seen as more and more organizations look at the value of change management, many more of them are starting to put together a centralized group, or a common approach is probably the better way to describe it, and that would be a change management office, a group that has responsibility for the standards, the ways of working, the measurements, so that it can be used effectively on every initiative. And you can see that the percentage of organizations that have a change management office continues to grow. The interesting thing on the right is we have a maturity model that we can understand how mature an organization is at their overall ability to apply change management. I won't have the opportunity, or I should say the time, to really go through that today. But what we've learned is those organizations that have a low level of maturity only achieve their project objectives 16% of the time. Those that move up in the maturity, which basically means it's consistently applied and they're always looking at ways to make improvements and to optimize it, are successful. Many are at a much greater percentage. You can see over 3/4 of the time. Processes. Here's where we need to really look at how do we integrate that focus on people adopting and using that new way of working into the other processes that are a key part of the organization and the initiatives. I'll spend a couple of moments here looking at some of the opportunities. When I think of integrating change management, it's not just into an IT project or a process improvement or moving to a new location, but think about it even in terms of how we accomplish work. We can describe that as change initiating processes, those improvement processes there in the second column, as well as related disciplines. So think of it, for example, and I'll just go through a couple in the next page. When we go through our strategy execution, when we're determining what we want to accomplish over the next couple of years, are we leveraging change management to understand which groups are being impacted? Is it the same group over and over and over again, and therefore are they likely to just say, I'm tired, I don't think I can incorporate all these things? So understanding from a strategy perspective who's being impacted, when, and to what degree. From a project management office, here is where we would want to integrate change management into those standard ways of doing work from a project perspective. I shared a page of what that might look like earlier in our session. When we look at customer experience, there's a large focus, over the last 3 to 5 years in understanding how do customers relate their experiences with us into their advocacy, into the way that they are satisfied with the products and services that we look at. Well, when we think about that from a customer experience and we understand those people are going through a change in the way that they work with us, in the way that they use our products and services, we would start to incorporate change management into that customer experience process. I could spend all day talking about how we could start to integrate these into our various ways of working, once again, into those change initiating processes, those integration or improvement processes, as well as related disciplines such as organization development, strategy execution, agile, and so on. So what I've presented in the last 35 minutes or so is a picture that says we need to focus on how well leadership is able to sponsor change throughout a broad set of initiatives. We've looked at, from a project perspective, how do we align the technical design of what we do and the people focus so that we can take them from that current state through that transition into the desired future outcome. And there again, I want to reinforce that the most challenging point is often not the beginning or the end. It's going through that transition of however long that may be. We spent a few moments looking at what kind of skills and capabilities are needed across the organization with sponsors and managers and those impacted by our changes, by project teams, as well as these professionals who really focus on this discipline of change management. We spent just a moment, and I didn't have time today to go into more detail into the reasons why organizations have a change management office, the value of it, but then understanding how does it fit into the way you do work and the way that you're trying to accomplish your objectives. And then said, yes, it makes sense to incorporate change management concepts into all of our processes so that it becomes the standard way of thinking. It's in the mindset of everybody as we're beginning our work, as we're conducting our work, and we're thinking about our objectives. I mentioned earlier that there's a model that says, how well are we doing this? What is our current level of maturity and what is our desired state? I showed that there were direct correlation between the maturity and how effective organizations were. And so just at a real simple level, I can describe those maturities at a level 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And based on where we are at or where you are at, we can design specific initiatives and objectives so that we can improve that by looking at all of these 5 wedges that I described in our session here today. Does this matter? I said a few moments ago that those organizations who have the highest level of maturity are much more likely to achieve success. Now, I put it in the frame of money. Money isn't always or the only way to measure success. For example, it can be improved customer satisfaction. It can be adoption of processes. It can be the way that employees or society views the things that are going on and are actually adopting and using it. But the overall point is those organizations that have a higher level of change management maturity are much more likely to be successful. So when we think about it, once again, I described it in terms of building these individual competencies at various levels throughout the organization. I described that we need to integrate change management into our standard project methodology so that we focus not only on the what, the technical things that we do, but on the people side of things, which is how do individuals go through those times of change? And how do we do this in a repeatable, structured way that can be efficient and effective? And coming back to our theme of today, sustainable. One of the things that I would encourage you to do, and we won't have time to do this today, and that is to go through an exercise that I describe as standing in the future. And I can quickly describe it as pretend we're in 2023 or 2024, and we were effectively achieving the objectives that we're after with our various initiatives for the ministry level or any of those combined efforts. And we would say, what would we like to see from leaders? What would we like to see in terms of people using a common language for understanding adoption and usage? What would we like to see as a mindset for change? Sometimes I call this a growth mindset. What would we like to see in the way our organization is organized with these centers of excellence, a change management office, or these change enabling roles? What would we like to see in terms of accelerating outcomes? What I have found is that if we describe the future state and then work backwards, we're much more likely to get there than simply by describing rather arbitrary objectives. So think about doing a standing in the future exercise with yourself, with the organization that you're a part of. And then start to take action. Here's some simple things that are aligned with those 5 wedges that I shared today. A common language, using methods and tools throughout the organization, embedding these processes and tools with internal processes, building the capability through application on target changes or specific projects. It doesn't make sense to do this at a broad area that doesn't have focus. What I have found is that it makes much more sense to think about it in terms of how are we going to do this on project A or initiative B rather than simply a broad enterprise capability. And you can see these things in terms of adapting materials for adoption of what makes sense for you, customizing the way that it's done, and incorporating it into other learning and development activities. These are things that will support the accomplishment within those 5 wedges, those 5 focus areas that I've been describing today. And then put together a roadmap. I mentioned standing in the future. What would that look like for you in 4 years from now? Here's just a very, very simple one, and I won't have opportunity to go through in depth, but this might be what we do this year, next year, in 2021 and 2022 with some themes, and then putting together the roadmap that says which projects, which people, which initiatives, how are we going to specifically know whether or not we're achieving the objectives, and then putting in place the focus and the activities to make that happen. So once again, it can be interesting and nice to attend a short webinar here, but if we don't take action, it's just an intellectual exercise. And so I challenge myself, I challenge you to think through what are those next steps, whether it's a standing in the future exercise, whether it's applying it on a project that you're specifically on now, or actually just taking the next steps with your organization to focus on how can we actually make sure that our initiatives are actually achieved. And so with that, I'd like to bring it back to our moderator, Dr. 3M, and see if there are any questions that people have raised, any topics that people would like to elaborate further on, and we can go forward from there. I want to thank you for your time today.